We live in a world in which we are eons away from real political pressure or accountability being applied to Israel.
Taking centre stage today is Pulitzer Prize winning author Nathan Thrall, whose book A Day in the Life of Abed Salama highlights the everyday struggles of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank. Thrall also worked as the director of the Arab-Israeli project with the International Crisis Group for a decade in both Israel and Palestine. In this episode, he talks about the fragile Gaza ceasefire, public support for Palestinians around the world, and how US and Israeli politics can influence the future of the region. Nathan Thrall, thank you so much for joining us here on Centre Stage. It really is a pleasure and a privilege to have your time with us.
Pleasure is mine.
First of all, if we can start talking about the ceasefire, and obviously no one's really sure about how things are going to play out in the days and weeks and months ahead, but can you just first of all tell us a little bit about what you think has been the issues that it's really taken so long to get to this point, and the makeup with the three phases and how complicated that really makes the entire process?
Yeah. I mean, there's just been one issue at the center of all of these negotiations from day one, which is Hamas has wanted a full ceasefire and an end to the war, meaning a full Israeli withdrawal, and Israel has refused. Israel regards it as a failure if this war ends and Hamas is still in place. Now, that goal of, quote unquote, eradicating Hamas is unachievable. So Israel has set it up for their own public that they're going to fail no matter what unless the war drags on and there's no declared end to it. And until this very day, that has been the central issue. And what we have with this ceasefire agreement is an agreement for phase one. And the real question is, will it extend to phase two? Because if it doesn't, what you have is a limited exchange of prisoners and hostages. But there is absolutely no guarantee that you get to phase two. And there are very strong incentives on the Israeli side to not conclude the negotiations over phase two, say that we haven't achieved what we set out to do in phase two, and so the war resumes.
Going back to October the 7th, I mean, Netanyahu and his coalition basically said that they wanted to flatten Gaza, eradicate Hamas, wipe them off the face of the earth. Have you been surprised since then that they've seemingly been allowed to do that?
I wish I could say that I have been surprised, but I haven't, because the long-standing U.S. policy is to support Israel basically no matter what. And this war could not have been conducted without U.S. support. The majority of the bombs dropped are U.S. bombs. And the U.S. had all the leverage in the world and could have ended it a very long time ago, and it didn't. And there needs to be a real change in U.S. politics, in the kind of pressure that's brought to bear by people who are horrified by what's been happening on the U.S. government to make sure that policy changes and that this doesn't happen in the future.
You've seen pockets of resistance and support and solidarity for Palestinians, countries like Ireland, especially in the Western world. But in the end of the day, none of those pockets really have made any sort of difference, have they?
Yeah, all of the political power is still with Israel in Western Europe and the United States. That said, I wouldn't say that the protests haven't mattered. I think that they have mattered. I think that they are one of the few things that we can draw hope from. What we've really seen is a generational shift. And those young people today have no political power. But in 20 years, they will have political power. And the hope that we can draw from those protests is that that generational change will manifest itself in changed policies in the future. But that should not be overstated when we're looking at the actual imbalance of power today. Again, it's all with Israel. Look at an issue. You mentioned Ireland. You look at Europe. Most Europeans, I don't think, want there to be settlement products in their supermarkets. And yet they're there. And it's nowhere on the horizon to remove settlement products from European supermarkets. So I think we have to hold two things in our minds at the same time. One, the possibility of very long-term change. Two, the fact that there's not going to be real significant change anytime in the near future.
Many people don't really understand, mainly just through ignorance, just simply not being exposed to it, exactly what the plight of Palestinians is actually like for people that live in the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. How do you go about explaining to people? Have you got real life examples that you give of this is what they have to go through every single day?
I think one of the most powerful experiences is to take people to a checkpoint at 5 a.m., watching thousands of Palestinians lining up who've woken up an hour before that to get there, and standing crowded shoulder to shoulder within cages to get through and work in jobs inside Israel, largely in construction. Just to see that scene at 5 a.m., I think is a very powerful and telling experience for people. And also, the aim of my book really was to take one rather commonplace event, a car accident, in this case, an accident involving a school bus filled with kindergartners, and showing what it means for that common event to take place in this very uncommon location, and to show what it means for a father to be racing to the site of an accident and be told that his son could be at hospitals that he can't reach because he can't go through a checkpoint because he's got the wrong color ID. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do is to put flesh on these words like occupation that are very abstract, that leave people cold, and to really allow them to see them through the eyes of the occupied people.
Do you think if more people actually grasp the realization, the difference between a blue ID and the access that gives you versus a green ID and the lack of access that gives you, that depending on who you are, where you live, it gives you completely, I guess, the ability to live your life normally. Do you think that if more people realized fully that every element of these people's lives are dictated by which badge they have, that something would change?
I do think so. I mean, that is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. I've seen the change take place when people go on tours in the West Bank. I've seen when people go in Hebron and they stand on a segregated road. They stand on a road that's what the Israelis call sterile, meaning free of Palestinians. And Palestinians who live on this road, their front doors are welded shut by the Israeli army. They can't even enter or exit their homes through the front door. Many of them climb up ladders to get to their houses through the roof. And when a person sees that, they see a road that they as tourists and Israeli Jewish settlers can walk on, but the Palestinians who live on that road cannot. It's a punch in the gut. And people immediately start to make comparisons to Jim Crow and to apartheid. It's undeniable for them. And I think that kind of emotional reaction is much more powerful and long-lasting than any kind of argumentation that people make. And so, yes, I do believe that the more that we show people what that reality is, the more we can have governments, particularly in the West, start to say, at the very least, I'm not going to be complicit in it. I'm no longer going to defend it. I'm no longer going to arm it. I'm no longer going to support it economically.
Abed Salama, who is the main character in your book, he said that he decided to tell you a story because he thought it was actually going to make a difference. Do you think that it has? And in what way?
I think it has made some difference. I want to be modest in describing what kind of difference it's made, because the fact is we live in a world in which we are eons away from real political pressure or accountability being applied to Israel. So the most that Abed or I could hope for is to make a dent and to inch things in the right direction. But on a personal level, meeting people who have read the book, people who have come to Abed with tears in their eyes, I absolutely know that it has made a difference in some people's lives.
Obviously, Donald Trump is the president. What is going to change, if anything, in regards to the occupied West Bank and all of those issues? Or are we going to see Israeli military continue to expand settlements and things are going to continue as they are, or potentially even get worse, do you think?
So no matter who is the American president, Israeli settlements are going to continue. Israeli land confiscation is going to continue. The arrest of Palestinians without charge or trial is going to continue. All of those things are continuing no matter who is the American president. Now, under Trump, it's possible that they will get even worse. And based on the people he has appointed, who are even unwilling to call the occupation of the West Bank an occupation, people who are referring to those lands as Judea and Samaria, like the settlers do, we have every indication that Trump plans to allow Israel to ramp up its slow-motion colonization of the West Bank, which is happening less slowly than before, and without any pretense of being in opposition to him.
I mean, how frustrating is that to watch over and over and over again as the death toll keeps mounting, as more prisoners are taken into custody in the occupied West Bank?
It's infuriating. It's infuriating, and it's one of the reasons that I actually left a decade of work at the International Crisis Group, where I was tasked with engaging with policymakers, people who worked in the U.S. State Department and elsewhere in Western governments. And I had so many conversations with those people where they told me, frankly, I won't change what I'm doing or what I'm saying publicly because the political circumstances won't allow it. That even the tiniest little incremental change that I could make would result in my potentially losing my job, potentially ending my career, being defamed, having months of headache from pro-Israel or advocacy organizations, and then also U.S. elected representatives. And so I'm simply not gonna risk it. And what I sought to do at that point was to say, I want to try and make some kind of contribution to changing that atmosphere so that a future policymaker has more space to act on what they actually believe in because public opinion has changed, because the way that the media is covering it has changed.
I know that you wanted to leave there, like you say, to make more of a difference, I believe in your words. Do you feel like you've made more of a difference in writing this? I mean, obviously winning the Pulitzer gives it a much greater awareness around the world.
It's very hard to measure, but I do. I do, and regardless of me personally, I think that that is the kind of work that needs to be done to really bring about a change. It doesn't matter if we convince all of the policy elites. There's a revolving door in Washington where people sit in a think tank for 4 years and then they enter the government and then they return to a think tank. It's a small group of people, and you could convince every single one of them that Israel is practicing apartheid and the U.S. is supporting it, and the U.S. support for it is essential to its longevity. And it doesn't matter because those people, even when they're convinced privately, will not act on it until there is a real shift in public opinion.
How do you go about shifting public opinion?
I think through storytelling. I think through narrative. I think by bringing more Palestinian voices to light. I think by journalists going and telling stories from these places, showing, that image of these people in cages at 5 a.m. Trying to get to their jobs. I think those kinds of things can make a difference.
The story that you tell in your book is about a father in the most desperate, dire situation that I guess any parent can ever potentially imagine. Was that a deliberate choice that you wanted to obviously show what he's going through, but also that the most vulnerable in Palestinian society are the ones that are worst affected?
Yes, it was absolutely a deliberate choice. This is a universal story. It's something that everybody can connect to. It's certainly something that I deeply connected to. In a way, writing this book was confronting my worst nightmare. My worst nightmare would be to hear that one of my children, and my youngest was around the age of Abed's son at the time of the accident when I was writing the book, to hear that she was on a school bus that had been in a crash, and then to add to that it was on a road completely controlled by Israel, where it took over a half an hour for the first Israeli fire truck to arrive on the scene. So I wanted to tell a story that was universal and that would grab people emotionally and make them feel for a second what it is to be a Palestinian living under occupation. And there are other stories I tell in that book that I think that parents can connect to as well. You know, the story of a mother whose son is taken from her in the middle of the night for writing anti-occupation graffiti and throwing stones at an occupying army. Soldiers come, bang on her door at 1 a.m., take her child, and refuse to tell her what he's done, what he's being charged with, where they're taking him to, how long they're taking him, where she can find him. And this is a fear that every Palestinian family feels about their children, and they're living it day in and day out. What does that do to a parent to live with that fear constantly?
Going back to what we were talking about earlier about protesters, especially young people, the young generation, going out there and making their voices heard and standing in solidarity with Palestinians. It really goes back to that, doesn't it? And how important that is for those people around the world to put pressure on their governments, to then put pressure on Israel. Do you have hope that that is going to continue and blossom even further?
I do. I think that is growing. Again, they're growing from a very small place in terms of the balance of power. But it's growing, and the fact that it's a generational change is also something that we can draw hope from. And I fundamentally believe that in the decades ahead, we can get to a place of greater accountability and a real pressure on Israel, because without pressure, it will not change its path. The path that it's on now is to completely absorb the West Bank and perpetuate apartheid indefinitely.
What do you think is going to happen next? I mean, is it almost irrelevant who's in power with what you're saying? Who's in power in Israel? If regardless, if it's Netanyahu or the opposition?
That's absolutely right. That is the conclusion that I have drawn. Is that because change isn't going to come from within, it actually really doesn't matter who's in power inside Israel. Once you actually get to a point of putting real pressure on Israel, you've made it rational, no matter what the politics are of the government in place at the time, to choose a different path. And we have so much commentary in the Western media and in the Israeli press that tries to equate Netanyahu with Trump and the Israeli right with the Republicans in the United States, and it's a totally false analogy. You know, the Israeli left seeks an ethno-state. They want a Jewish demographic majority at all costs. That is their bottom line. They are driven by a desire to have Arabs out of their space. When Rabin was campaigning, a hero of the Israeli left, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he was campaigning on, we need to get Gaza out of Tel Aviv. So again, even if we just look at a couple of years ago, we had a government inside Israel that wasn't led by Netanyahu. And we're told constantly it's all because of Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is the problem, et cetera, et cetera. But that government behaved no differently toward the Palestinians than the Netanyahu government did in the West Bank.
Is there a message for people that reading your book or watching and listening to this that you'd like them to take away with them, potentially that there is some sort of hope for Palestinians at this point in time?
I'm filled with hope that justice will prevail in the very long run. But I think that it's up to us to tell these stories, to read these stories, to share them with our friends and relatives who are ignorant, And I think that if enough people do that, and more people are doing it, that we can have a different world.
Nathan Thrall, thank you so much for joining us here on Centre Stage. We really, really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.